Yeah.
Yeah. Camera reacts when you speak. Yeah. See that I'm speaking now.
Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants. I'm very happy to welcome you here to the site event. And I'm also very happy to open this site event. We will have the opportunity to hear about the latest research from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And I'm here with Mark Caleb and Alice Faraday. So let me introduce myself. I'm Diane Schmidt. I'm the European Union Anti-Trafficking Coordinator. So I'm dealing mainly with trafficking in human beings. Not to confuse with smuggling. I understand there is still a lot of confusion between trafficking in human beings and smuggling. Of course, there can be links. While for smuggling, you have to cross him over the border. The person who is smuggled into another country is not necessarily a victim of trafficking, while victims of trafficking in human beings are exploited in the context of sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, and this can happen in their country of origin. When you look at data in the European Union, you have more than half of the victims are EU citizens, and 30% of these EU citizens are trafficked or victims of trafficking in human beings within their own country of origin. So you do not have this cross-border aspect which you have in smuggling. But on the other hand, there can be links between trafficking and smuggling, and often you have the same organized crime groups or networks which are active in relation to growth. So you have people who, if I look now at the European Union, who want to enter the European Union, who are already victims of trafficking in their countries of origin, or simply are brought to some countries in the European Union. You have those who fall into the hands of traffickers on their way. I mean, Libya is unfortunately a sad example. And then you have those who are coming to the European Union, be it also through legal ways, and sometimes they are in a vulnerable situation, or they have debts, and they fall into the hands of traffickers and human beings. But I'm not here to discuss the difference, but I thought it's perhaps also interesting again to explain the difference, but also the links, because sometimes there's confusion, which is also linked to the word which is used differently in some languages. In French, you speak about in English you have trafficking human beings, in French trafficking and smuggling. So sometimes there's a same thing in Spain. So you have Spanish, so you have the confusion. But for policymakers, it's extremely important to have reliable data. And that's also why this research, which will be presented today, is extremely important. It will focus on the routes towards the central Mediterranean, and you will see from the 2022 data, which will be presented now, that the situation is different in relation to the different countries of origin or also of transit. But to give you some general elements, when you look at the 2022 data, you see already that there is an increase. In 2021, around 123,000 people arrived through the central Mediterranean route, and I'm basing myself here on the research, which will be presented in details. And in 2022, you have 159,000 more. So you see that there is an increase. Unfortunately, there are also still a lot of people who are missing, who died, taking this extremely dangerous food. We had in 2022 around 3,200 people who died who are being missing. So this is of course also a very sad story. And this is also why the European Union has an extremely comprehensive approach. And it's not working alone. It's working in partnership with the countries of transit, with the countries of origin, because dealing with smuggling and with trafficking is a problem which has to be addressed together. Nobody can do it alone. And there is often cross-border aspects which need cross-border cooperation. This is also why between the European Union and the country of origin and transit, there are dialogues, but there is also cooperation in relation to border protection, often also with the EU agency context. There is cooperation and capacity building in the context of law enforcement and judicial cooperation, which is extremely important because we have to go after the networks, we have to go after the criminals, we have to go after the perpetrators because this helps also in terms of prevention. Prevention is key, awareness raising, but also addressing the root causes of this irregular migration, which pushes people into the hands of traffickers and organized criminal networks. And of course, in the context of the global approach, you have also the return to the countries of origin, the integration, and you have opening of safe ways in order to ensure that people are not obliged to put their life into danger or fall into the hands of traffickers on their way to a better life in Europe or somewhere else. The situation is different according to the different countries, which will be presented now by Mark and by Alice. In Libya, in 2022, you had more than 80,000 attempts to cross the sea. This is around 20,000 more than 2021. We see not only people coming from sub-Saharan countries, but also from Bangladesh or Syria or even from Egypt. So I think this is also a big change compared to the previous situation. At international level, the European Union is working very closely with the African Union and the UN in a tripartite task force in order to improve the situation in Libya. Perhaps also work on Tunisia, because we see more and more people arriving from Tunisia, from Tunisian nationality, but also from other nationalities crossing the border. And the European Union has also increased the cooperation with Tunisia. Morocco, there was some decrease of direct arrivals from Morocco to Spain. The arrivals, however, increased in Ceuta and Melilla in 2022 by 57%, and then the arrivals increased also through the Canary Islands in the last years. Niger, there's a consolidation. There also we are cooperating very closely with Niger. It's an operation partnership to tackle migrant smuggling, and joint investigation teams are active in the region. As I said, I will not go into details, but again, it's extremely important to have this kind of research, to have the data, because if we do not know the situation, how can we address it? And it's also good to have this data at global level, taking also into account, as I said again, the situation in different countries around the European Union, in the European Union. And again, all our actions are based in close partnership. This is a partnership we have to continue also in the future. And now I pass the word to Mark, and who will bring us through, I think, mainly Tunisia and Libya.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and thanks especially for the explanation vis-a-vis the distinction between human smuggling and trafficking. That's very useful, because in the North Africa and Sahel context, there are many contexts where there's a very, very clear distinction between these two crimes. In the North Africa and Sahel context, there's often a very confusing continuum. So migrants will enter a situation as in a human smuggling situation where there's no coercion, but it's basically a service being transacted, then sliding into a trafficking situation and come out of it potentially re-entering a smuggling situation. So bear this in mind when we're delivering our presentation. I'm not going to be clarifying this distinction continuously, otherwise it would be pedantic, but it's very important to keep in mind. After that preamble, good morning, everyone. My name is Mark McAuliffe. I'm the director of the North Africa and Sahel Observatory for the Global Initiative. It's one of 3 observatories covering the African continent. We have other observatories covering other parts of the world. So our work in the region that we're going to talk about today is predicated on regular data collection. Principally, I would say 2-3 pillars. One of them is online analysis of whatever is published in relation to a specific field that can aid our political economy analysis of human smuggling and trafficking, which is what we're going to be talking about today. The second is data collection and fieldwork by our analysts on the ground as needed. And third is data collection through a network of monitors that we have on the ground in the areas where we work. And all of this is intended to develop a moving picture, basically, rather than collect one snapshot in time. We try to collect a picture week in, week out, and that enables us, hopefully, to be able to react to unfolding events quickly and be able to set those events in their proper historic context relatively rapidly. So what we're going to be presenting is the highlights of forthcoming research that we will be publishing. Should anyone be interested in receiving our research, there should be a list. You give us your email address, and we will make sure to send you our publications. Otherwise, you can go on our website and find them there. The slide, please. While that's happening, perhaps we can skip a couple of slides. Maybe a couple of slides further. Yeah, so that's more or less the region that our observatory covers. We don't cover all of those countries with the same level of intensity. Our core work is in Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, Niger, Chad, and Mali. Other observatories are covering other areas. We also do work in intermittent work in Western Sudan. Likely, we're going to be ramping up work over there, and also in light of the unfortunate conflict, and also Mauritania. So, next slide. Broadly speaking, in the post-COVID era, human smuggling and trafficking in this region has entered a new phase. Broadly speaking, since 2020, we have seen a rapid increase, as we just heard, in activity driven by a number of factors that include political instability, economic stress, as well as strategic positioning of criminal actors and armed groups around irregular migration and the exploitation of migrants for profit. In crude numbers, next slide. European states saw arrivals leap from just under 96,000 arrivals in 2020 to just over 159,000 in 2022. It should be said that the situation in Morocco also contributed to this picture, as did movement from Turkey to Italy, which is, I won't say it's a new route, but it was a dormant route that was reactivated lately. We won't be talking about those two scenarios, but it's important to note here. Today, we are concentrating on Libya, Tunisia, Niger, Chad, and Mali, sort of envisioned as what contributes to the central Mediterranean route. That said, this bird's eye view of the situation and what I've just said masks very significant distinctions between different countries that needs to be accounted for in any proper analysis. Next slide, please. From here on, the slides mostly are maps to aid, to be a visual aid, especially when we reference certain parts of the country. So both from an organized crime and stability perspective, Libya undoubtedly remains the most challenging country in the region. In Libya, we have seen a steady increase in activity over the past few years. In fact, in the summer of 2022, defined as the month between May and September, has been the busiest in terms of departures from the Libyan coast since 2017. And I'll explain later why I'm referencing 2017. With more than 48,000 departures reported in just 5 months, 18,000 more than in the same period in 2021. Trends till mid-April indicate that this upward trend is likely going to be sustained in this year. So the headline explanation for these changes, I'm going to be as brief as I can. It rests on 3 primary factors. The first is that following the pandemic, which only resulted in a very slight a temporary disruption in movement, and following the end of the last war on Tripoli in 2020, mobility became far easier in the Libyan coastal areas. And the second factor is that Libyan authorities all but abandoned politics of law enforcement that had been pushed until 2020. I'll go into this in a bit more detail, both in the west and east, I should point out. The third factor is that in 2022, smuggling surged in the east coast of Libya, particularly around Tobruk, so this side of the country, with an estimated 25% of all reported departures taking place from this region, which reflected the resurgence of previously dormant networks. Obviously, the reality is more complicated than this. So I'll be trying to go in a bit more detail without going into an extended time. I don't really have time to go into a lot of historic context, but I need to go over a couple of things, particularly in respect to what I said about marking 2017. So in 2017, we saw a collapse in departures, where departures dropped from a height of 180,000 in 2016 to about 120,000 in 2017, and kept sort of going down after that until they started climbing again in 2020. This is the result primarily, and this has been our thesis since 2016, that this was both the growth and the collapse was the result of activity related to militias in Libya. So the growth was the interest of militias in human smuggling and trafficking, and here is worth underlying trafficking, because both the movement of migrants is being monetized, and the detention and extortion of migrants is being monetized, the latter being more forms of human trafficking. So around 2017, the government of national accord at the time moved in to co-opt a number of militias that were involved in this activity, and some of these militias went literally from a smuggling outfit to a law enforcement outfit overnight, and this reflected itself in the number of departures. That paradigm is disintegrated if it hasn't disintegrated entirely. There is no longer much of this concern. If anything, now we have a situation where there is an unprecedented predation by militias of the state's migration management apparatus. Again, this is not a new phenomenon. However, we have never seen this level of predation in the post-revolution period. Critically, this environment that I have described also created a space for transnational organized outfits to return to Libya. And in 2017, when this activity was happening and when a number of coordinated actions were taking place between member states and also the European Union, there were a number of targeted activities in respect to criminal actors that actually have had a significant impact on, for instance, especially the East African network of smugglers and traffickers, going after a number of kingpins and prosecuting them internationally. Not all was rosy. There were some problems in that action, but by and large, it was having an impact. I'm talking also about the sanctioning of human smugglers in Libya. The problem was that the momentum wasn't held, and the dynamic in the meantime was changing on the ground. Besides the consistent information we collected on the ground, which is giving us these indicators, there are a number of indicators that I can sort of list, which reference this idea that there's a paradigm shift, and these include the increasing number of wooden boats that we're seeing in the departures from Libya. The sourcing of wooden boats and the use of wooden boats requires much more logistics than rubber boats, and therefore indicates a sophistication of the smuggling networks involved. The growing number of passengers on board, particularly from the east of Libya, and in particularly, and this was also referenced already, the increasing prevalence of migrants from relatively wealthier North African and non-African countries. I'm talking about Egypt, Bangladesh, Syria, and more lately, Pakistan. Why am I referencing these? Because, first of all, these cohorts of migrants are now the majority, whereas previously the flow of migrants from Libya predominantly constituted sub-Saharan Africans. Now these constitute the majority of the migrants flowing irregularly through Libya, and the majority of these migrants actually fly into Libya regularly and then catch a boat from Libya. More importantly, to our discussion of the criminal economy behind this, these are pre-planned, long-leg operations, and therefore the smuggling networks involved in these operations are very often sitting in Dhaka, sitting in Abu Dhabi, sitting in Cairo, and they are managing an extremely complex multi-leg operation whereby the migrant would purchase an entire trip covering Dhaka to landing in Italy. This is very different from, a very low-level smuggler reacting basically to a demand from migrants coming to that person saying, I want to cross this border, how much? And there's that transaction. Here we're talking about a proper criminal enterprise. Why does it matter? Because we had seen an evaporation of this sort of activity in Libya. And what we had seen post-2017 is mostly smuggling networks retreating into clandestinity, small atomized groups operating in a reactive manner, which is a very different problem than when you have transnational organized crime. I'll stop there on Libya. Maybe we can talk about it a bit more when we're doing a question and answer. We'll switch quickly to Tunisia, where we have a very different scenario. Next slide, please. Tunisia also experienced an upsurge in departures, but in Tunisia we have a very different scenario. So the primary paradigm operating in Tunisia is a drive which is prompted by a mixture of a political and economic crisis. So in 2021, departures hit 43,000, surpassing a peak that had only been seen in the aftermath of the Tunisian revolution. The trend was sustained in 2022, and so far this year, at least until the 15th of May, there were just under 44,500 irregular departures from Tunisia, representing an unprecedented level, and actually Tunisia overtaking Libya, at least for the time being, in terms of departures. Most of these migrants, and this is the perhaps one of the most interesting phenomena, have been Ivorians, Guineans, West Africans, and Sahelians. So Tunisia is becoming an important transit country for international migration, and some facilitated by structured networks. But in the case of Tunisia, even criminally, we see a different scenario. Most of it remains ad hoc, pretty atomized, very low level, small scale human smuggling. So why this is important, and ties into what Alex is going to be talking about in a short while. So two things. One, because we're in terms of sheer numbers, we're still in the winter months. And in the winter months, typically, we always see a drop in the number of Tunisians embarking from Tunisia, which then climbs in the summer. So if we have to cast into the future, this is something to watch, because the likeliness is that in the summer month, we're going to see more Tunisians embarking alongside West Africans and Sahelians. The second, and I feel the most important, is this element that Tunisia is becoming an important transit hub at a time when in Libya, actually, Libya is becoming less important as a regional transit hub, but is becoming a more important international transit hub. Because in Libya and in the countries buttressing Libya and acting as a transit to Libya and the Sahel, we actually saw a drop, as Alice is going to be elaborating on now. Again, I think I'll wrap it up there, and maybe we can carry on further in the question and answer. Alice.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. So I'm Alice Faraday. I'm a senior analyst with the North African Sahel Observatory. I focus mainly on the Sahel, in particular on Niger and Chad, and particularly on human smuggling and trafficking dynamics. So I'm going to take you through a few of the main trends that we've seen over the last year or so in Niger, Chad, and also Mali. So starting with Niger, over the course of the last year or 18 months, human smuggling dynamics have been largely characterized by really the consolidation of trends that have been underway since 2016. So these trends are not new, but they have been consolidating over the last 6 years. Following the collapse of the migrant smuggling economy in Agadez in 2016, due to the criminalization of the transport of migrants. So this led most smugglers, or passeurs, as they are known at the local level, to seek alternative activity. So most smuggling networks in Agadez, which you can see on the map, have actually reorganized, and they've turned to cater instead to, on the one hand, very high demand for transport of Nigerian seasonal workers who are traveling into Libya. So this is a very significant alternative activity for passers. It's less lucrative per passenger, but it's safer because it's tolerated by Nigerian authority. And also it provides quite a constant pool of passengers for passengers that they can rely on. So it's quite an attractive business for them. Another important alternative is gold mining. So we've seen a massive gold rush in the Sahel, and in particular in Saharan gold fields in the north of Niger, which you can see on the map. There's Chibahakaten and Jado, both in the very far north of Niger. This has provided a lot of alternative activities, either in the transport of people to and from the gold fields, so starting from Agadez or also Arlit, but also in auxiliary services and trade that supply the gold fields. So some passers have turned to the transport of water, equipment, goods, and also in some cases illicit activities such as drug trafficking. Another alternative, which is potentially the most attractive, is the transport of migrants to Algeria. So one of the major trends we've seen is the shift of movements of foreign migrants towards Algeria. These routes to Algeria have been significantly less impacted by the crackdown on human smuggling in Niger, and departures have really surged in key hubs such as Tawa, which service the routes to Algeria. So Tawa is a major hub for transport to Algeria. It's grown substantially in importance since around 2019. And it caters to this increasing demand for transport to Algeria. These journeys to Algeria are in particular attractive and popular among Francophone migrants, but also other groups. And what we've seen is that although these journeys are particularly dangerous because they involve crossing the Algerian border on foot, which involves crossing quite a high sand berm, they are very popular, and this popularity has continued to grow over the last few years. What does remain of the transport of foreign migrants to Libya involves much more dangerous routes now. So this is something obviously we have seen over the last few years, but these risks posed to migrants who are using these bypass routes to reach Libya have continued to increase over the last few years. So smugglers will use different routes now to dodge security measures and bypass the sort of main policed areas. And they will venture into more remote and dangerous territories that actually bear very significant risks to migrants themselves, because accidents or breakdowns are often fatal for migrants. So if we move to the next slide, we've highlighted one of the main routes that is used at the moment for the transport of foreign migrants to Libya. It connects the Nigerian border to the Libyan border, and it bypasses all major towns. And this is now one of the main itineraries for foreign migrants. And actually, in addition to the risks of accidents and breakdowns, it's also a route that coincides with areas that are targeted by banditry. So armed banditry has been on the rise since around 2020 in the Agadez region. It's closely linked to the increased presence of foreign armed groups in the area, and in particular in cross-border areas with Chad and Libya. But it's not only been on the rise in these very in these areas in the far north, it's actually also been on the rise along main roads. So this is quite a new trend. So the main roads leading from Agadez to Dirkul, for instance, have been increasingly targeted by bandits over the last couple of years. And we've seen actually an increase in attacks on individuals and smugglers who are traveling to Libya, including those who use the military convoy. And this is in addition to interceptions that target high-value drug convoys, for instance, in the far northeast. And another clear trend that's emerged linked to banditry is the targeting of gold convoys across the Agadez region, gold convoys coming from Shibahakaten or Jado. So this is a really lucrative activity for bandit groups. And because these routes actually coincide with routes that are used for the transport of migrants, it further raises the risks posed to those who are traveling. So what we've seen overall in Niger is a continued contraction of human smuggling activities between Niger and Libya, while routes to Algeria have increased massively in popularity. And then, of course, the shift to routes to Libya that have been displaced to more remote and dangerous areas. Meanwhile, in Chad, on the next slide, human smuggling dynamics have also seen a significant contraction, but for different reasons. So human smuggling in Chad mainly involves transport to gold fields in northern Chad. So from eastern, western, and southern Chad, these movements, they mostly involve smugglers because travel to northern Chad has mostly been banded. It's quite complex, but overall, these movements have been tightly controlled due to the perceived risk of Chadians joining rebel groups in the north and in southern Libya. So most people use the services of passeurs to reach the gold fields in the north. And most people who are traveling north are prospective gold miners, both Chadian and foreign. There are also some individuals who are aiming to reach southern Libya, and there are a few foreign migrants who will travel to the gold fields with the ultimate aim of then reaching Libya and then Europe. But these numbers are relatively low. And actually, building on what was discussed previously on the link between human trafficking and human smuggling, the transport of people to the gold fields there's significant risk of human trafficking, and it is a good example of the very complex relationship between human smuggling and human trafficking. So people will travel on credit to gold fields, enter indentured labor agreements, and this makes them very vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation. So moving on, another key trend also in Chad is actually, well, not so much a trend, but what we can say about northbound movements in Chad is that they are very closely linked to whatever is happening in the gold field. So a good example of this is in 2022 in May, clashes broke out at one of the biggest gold fields in northern Chad, in Kogi. The gold field was subsequently closed entirely and evacuated, and all movements to the north were pretty much suspended. And then when the gold field reopened in October, movements started again in a massive way. So it really shows just how strong this link between human smuggling and gold mining is in Chad. Just lastly as well, I have to mention also the impact of the outbreak of conflict in Sudan. So just briefly, we've seen a major surge in arrivals in eastern Chad from Sudan, involving Sudanese refugees and Chadian returnees, around 60,000 people, which is really massive considering the already strained assistance capacities. And also there are significant concerns of fighters from Libya-based Chadian fighters who may be drawn into the conflict. Just one or two words on Mali to finish off. Migration in Mali has been largely influenced by seasonal changes and by the worsening of the security situation in central and northern Mali. So we know that Timbuktu remains a relatively stable and active hub in northern Mali. And another key hub is Gao, which is also a major node for seasonal work at gold mines in the region. And this hub has been very highly affected by insecurity in central Mali and increased attacks by the Islamic State Sahel province. But overall, aside from seasonal variations and the impact of insecurity, we can say that human smuggling dynamics in Mali have been relatively stable, and it really shows a certain resilience of smuggling networks there. I will end there and hopefully leave some time for questions, so feel free. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. Thank you very much, Mark, for this very interesting information. Yes, we have 30 minutes for questions and answers. Don't hesitate. Perhaps Ambassador Caron would also like to say what about another site event, which might be.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Caron, the Special Envoy for Counterterrorism, Fight Against Organized Crime in Paris. I'm very glad to be here at this event, and so I listened with great attention, interest to the presentations, because what this shows is that this phenomenon is really a shapeshifter, and so it's very difficult, and so it's a real challenge for policymakers and response enforcers, because the networks and dynamics change very much, very often, and the challenge for us is to how to respond, how to adapt the response to these evolutions. So basically, I'm very like with a little bit of smugness to say that I'm very glad to be chairing this afternoon a complementary event to this event this morning, which is about strengthening policies against organized criminal networks involved in the smuggling of migrants and related crimes and trafficking human beings along the central and western Mediterranean routes. Now, I think this really nicely dovetails with this morning, because we had a very excellent exposition and evaluate an assessment of the phenomenon. This afternoon, we'll look from the other end of the spectrum we try to get into the nitty-gritty of how you cooperate and how you help the countries that are that are concerned to respond and fight against it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. So, also online, you can raise your hand and ask questions. If there are any comments, seems that everything was clear.
There are some questions.
I see.
Yes, yes, online.
Questions here. Someone on right. So one question is regarding the route to Algeria in Niger. Are we seeing any changes in demand following the massive returns, deportations of migrants by Algerian authorities? So yes, this is also a significant dynamic that has impacted the situation at the Algerian border. The number of migrants who are deported each month from Algeria, which involves both Nigerian migrants and foreign migrants. This number has been increasing quite significantly. This is a major challenge in Arlit, which is the sort of main town, which hosts IOM transit centres, but also further downstream in Agadez. So we know that assistance frameworks are already running at full capacity. So this increase in expulsions at the Algerian border is something that we are monitoring quite closely, and it is having quite a large, quite an important impact. Also in terms of risk for migrants, but also in terms of the strain that it puts on local communities. So that's what I can say. And
There's another question about
on gold fields.
about the movement towards the gold field.
Oh, so why is there a N'Djamena Abishir west-east route? So that's a good question. Actually, so one thing I didn't have time to mention in my presentation is that movements to northern Chad, as I said, they have been tightly restricted actually since 2021 due to the major upheaval following the FACT rebel incursion and the subsequent death of former President Deby. There was a major crackdown, in particular on routes from the Kanem region to the north. So the Kanem region is in the southwest, and it's a region that has been associated with heightened risks of recruitment to rebel groups. So actually those are the routes that have been massively impacted. So in order to reach northern Chad, a lot of people actually go from N'Djamena to Abishir because routes from Abishir to northern Chad have been less affected by security measures. And actually, there is a relative ease of movement between Abishir and northern Chad. It's a major hub. It's also a hub for people coming from Sudan. So that's why there's a N'Djamena Abishir axis.
There's another question concerning Tunisia. Have you ever come across instances of polycriminality of criminal actors when analyzing the role of migrant smugglers in Tunisia? So the short answer is yes. It's not vast, but there are instances, especially in the north of the country. So typically this happens on fast boats, speedboats, which from a human smuggling perspective would be hired by Tunisians paying a premium to be on a smaller group of people on a relatively fast boat, and the overlap typically is with cigarette smuggling, and in the past there were reports as well of drug trafficking. So predominantly I would say in the contraband ambit. There is a much more pronounced overlap in Libya, and in particular, and I feel that this is a very under the radar phenomenon, because a number of, and I'm talking about high level organized criminals. I'm not talking about low-level stuff. High-level criminals who are at the top of a significant human smuggling and human trafficking operation. So doing both the movement and extorting migrants at the same time, and atop a very significant drug trafficking dynamic. And one of the areas that is most underreported and under, I feel, even government's radars is the trafficking of prescription medication. So over the past few years in the North African and even Sahelian regions, we have seen a very significant proliferation of prescription medication being filtering into the recreational market, so to speak. I'm talking about drugs such as tramadol, which is relatively known, and I'm also talking about drugs like pregabalin, for instance, sold under the brand name Lyrica. The problem with these drugs is, so first of all, they are fueling the same criminal networks that are then involved in other areas. And here, as I said, we see a very significant overlap between smuggling and trafficking. But more importantly, at the international level, at the level where they're transiting the Mediterranean, which has become a massive, very important vehicle for the transit of narcotics and these prescription medications. When it comes to narcotics, cocaine and hashish, where we also saw an increase of the Mediterranean's use as a logistics highway, those drugs are illegal, and there's a lot of interdiction activity taking place by North African countries as well as Southern European countries. When it comes to prescription medication at the level of the Mediterranean, all of this stuff is illegal, and there's no way of intervening, interdicting, and disrupting it. And therefore, you've got a steady revenue flow for a number of militias that are involved at very high level criminality that is then aiding them and fueling other activity in other areas, which is, I think, very important to understand.
Thank you very much. I see no other questions, so I think we can close there. I really would like to thank Mark and Alice from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime for their work on this and the presentations today. I would like to underline once more how important it is to understand the trends of what is behind the different flows and what's behind smuggling and trafficking. I think what was mentioned also right now is important, the link with other kind of crime, drugs. I would also underline how important it is to go after the assets of the criminals. You have to go after the money because it's the money who drives the criminals also to continue their crime. And again, this trend from the data is so important, such in order to define the priorities, the cooperation between the different countries and between law enforcement authorities, the funding, the different policies which have to be made in order to stop the criminals. So what you are doing is important. We also, I guess, looking forward to the side event, which is organized by France, which will follow up a little bit on this. I would like to thank all the participants also. And yeah, thank you.
From our end, if I can just, I would like to thank you for sharing this, for accepting to share this event. We were very honored that you accepted. Thank the EU and the Netherlands for sponsoring the event, and the EU also for constantly supporting us. And I would like to invite you to a series of events that we have organized today and in the coming days. A number of side events on our portfolio of work on organized crime in various parts of the country. Thank you very much.